Welcome back. Tonight we begin with one of history's most ambitious construction projects, the Great Pyramid of Giza. For centuries, Hollywood has sold us images of whip-cracking overseers and thousands of slaves dying under the Egyptian sun. But the truth? It's somehow both more impressive and more miserable than you'd imagine. Tonight, we're going to walk through what it was actually like to be a pyramid builder in ancient Egypt around 2600 BCE. And spoiler alert, you wouldn't have lasted a day. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start with how you ended up at Giza in the first place. Because, contrary to popular belief, you weren't kidnapped, you weren't enslaved, and you weren't chained to a stone block like something out of a Cecil B. DeMille fever dream. You were drafted. Every year, when the Nile flooded and covered your farming village in a blessed layer of fertile silt, you had a problem. No fields to plow, no crops to tend, just you, your family, and 3 to 4 months of waiting around for the water to recede. That's when the pharaoh's bureaucrats showed up. These weren't soldiers with swords. They were scribes with papyrus scrolls, reed pens, and an unsettling amount of organizational efficiency. They had lists of every able-bodied man in every village along the Nile, lists with your name on them. The system was called the Corvée, a national labor tax. If you were a farmer, which you probably were because 90% of Egypt was farmers, you owed the pharaoh a certain amount of work each year. Think of it like jury duty, except instead of sitting in a courthouse, you're hauling 2-ton limestone blocks up a ramp in 120-degree heat. No, you couldn't get out of it by claiming a bad back. Everyone had a bad back. That was just called being alive in the Bronze Age. The bureaucrats would arrive during the flood season, usually around July, when the Nile swelled like an over-enthusiastic sponge. They'd gather the village men in the town square and read names from their scrolls. Your name, your brother's name, your neighbor who you didn't like anyway because he always borrowed your tools and never returned them. Congratulations. You've been selected to serve Pharaoh Khufu, may he live forever, in the construction of his eternal resting place. Some men volunteered. Yes, actually volunteered. Why? Because working on the pyramid meant guaranteed food, daily rations of bread and beer, meat, actual meat, not the occasional fish you caught if you were lucky. Plus, there was a certain prestige to it. You were building a stairway to the heavens, a monument that would last forever, a divine project that connected Earth to the afterlife. Or maybe you just really needed to eat. Either way, you packed a small bag, maybe a spare linen tunic, a wooden comb, a good luck amulet, and you began the journey to Giza. The walk could take days, depending on where your village was. You traveled in groups, hundreds of men, from dozens of villages, all heading north toward the capital. At night, you camped by the roadside, shared stories, and wondered what you'd gotten yourself into. And then, one morning, you crested a hill and saw it. The pyramid. Even unfinished, it was massive. A mountain of limestone rising from the desert plateau, catching the first light of dawn like a beacon. Around it, thousands of men swarmed like ants, pulling ropes, hauling stones, shouting orders, the sound of hammers and chisels ringing across the sand. You weren't looking at a construction site. You were looking at a city built entirely around the single purpose of stacking rocks into the most perfect geometric shape human hands could create. And you, with your calloused farmer's hands and your aching knees, were about to become part of it. Welcome to Giza. Hope you brought sunscreen. Just kidding. Sunscreen won't be invented for another 4,600 years. After your long walk from wherever your village was, let's say you're from a farming settlement 2 days south, you arrive at the workers' village. Archaeologists today call it Heit el-Ghurab. You would have called it that place where 20,000 people live, crammed together like sardines. This wasn't a temporary camp of tents. This was a planned city. Mud brick walls, organized streets, workshops, bakeries, breweries, storage facilities, and dormitories. Everything you'd need to keep a massive workforce alive and somewhat functional for the next few decades. But let's talk about where you'd sleep. Your new home was a long, narrow gallery, basically a barracks. Inside, about 40 men shared a single room. No beds, no privacy, no personal space. Just a stone platform running along each wall, maybe a foot off the ground, where you'd lay down your thin reed mat and call it a night. Picture a college dorm room, but remove the mattresses, the walls between roommates, the doors, the windows, and replace it all with rock-hard stone slabs and the collective body heat of 39 other sweaty men who've been hauling limestone all day. The pillow situation was particularly grim. You didn't get a fluffy down pillow. You got a curved wooden or stone headrest. Yes, stone. It propped your neck up at an awkward angle and was about as comfortable as sleeping on a brick. But here's the thing. It served a practical purpose. Elevating your head kept scorpions from crawling into your ear at night, because apparently that was a real concern in ancient Egypt. Sweet dreams. The dormitory itself was dark, smoky, and surprisingly well organized. Each gallery had its own entrance, its own cooking area, and its own little communal courtyard. During the day, men gathered there to eat, repair tools, or just collapse in whatever shade they could find. At night, the sound was overwhelming. Snoring, coughing, babies crying. Yes, babies, because some workers brought their families. The smell wasn't great either. 40 men sharing one room with no showers, no deodorant, and limited ventilation meant the air had a certain character. But you weren't alone. You were part of a crew now. The men sleeping next to you were your teammates. You'd work together, eat together, and probably complain together about your sore backs and the foreman who never seemed to sleep. Outside your dormitory, the workers' village buzzed with activity. Bakeries churned out thousands of loaves of bread daily. Breweries fermented massive vats of thick, nutritious beer. Butchers slaughtered cattle and sheep. Archaeologists found over 175,000 animal bones at the site, evidence of the staggering amount of food required to keep this operation running. There were coppersmiths repairing tools, carpenters building sledges, potters making bread molds, and probably a guy whose entire job was just yelling at people to work faster. And then there was the cemetery. Just beyond the village, rows of simple graves held the bodies of workers who didn't make it home. These weren't slaves dumped in unmarked pits. These were proper burials. Men and women laid to rest with care, their bodies oriented toward the rising sun, their graves marked, their tools buried with them for the afterlife. If you were going to die building the pharaoh's pyramid, and some people did, at least you'd be buried near the monument itself. For ancient Egyptians, that was an honor. It meant your spirit would dwell in the shadow of eternity. Not the retirement plan you'd hoped for, but hey, at least it came with meaning. Let's talk about what kept you alive. Food. Because surprisingly, the pyramid builders ate better than most people in ancient Egypt. Every morning before the sun turned the desert into a convection oven, you lined up with your crew for rations. A basket with 10 loaves of bread and a jug of beer. That was your daily allotment, non-negotiable, state-sponsored, Pharaoh-approved carbs. The bread wasn't artisanal sourdough with a perfect crust. It was dense, grainy, and often full of sand and grit from the stone mills used to grind the wheat. Chewing it was like chewing edible sandpaper. Over time, it wore down your teeth, leaving them cracked, chipped, and painful. But it was calories, and calories meant energy, and energy meant you could haul another block. The beer was different from what you're imagining. This wasn't a cold lager you'd crack open after work. It was thick, porridge-like, and only mildly alcoholic. It was made from partially baked barley bread soaked in water and left to ferment, nutritious, hydrating, and safe to drink, because the Nile water, while sacred, was also full of parasites. Everyone drank beer, men, women, children. It was basically ancient Egypt's version of Gatorade. But here's where it gets interesting. You also got meat. Archaeologists discovered that pyramid workers consumed enormous quantities of meat: beef, mutton, goat. We're talking about 11 cattle and 37 sheep or goats slaughtered every single day just to feed the workforce. That's over 4,000 pounds of meat daily. For context, most Egyptian peasants ate meat maybe a few times a year during festivals. You, a pyramid builder, were eating it regularly, roasted over open fires, served in stews, chewed off the bone after a long day's work. Why the lavish diet? Simple economics. The pharaoh needed you strong. A weak, malnourished workforce couldn't move 2.3 million stone blocks, so he fed you well, not out of kindness, out of efficiency. Some workers even got fish from the Nile, lentils, onions, garlic, and if you were very lucky, a handful of dates or figs. It wasn't gourmet, but it was fuel. There was also evidence of medical care tied to nutrition. Workers with injuries or illnesses received special rations, extra protein, honey for wounds, herbal remedies. The state didn't want you dying halfway through the project. Mealtime itself was communal. You sat in the courtyard with your crew, tore bread with your hands, dipped it in whatever stew was available, and washed it down with thick beer. Conversations flowed, complaints about the heat, jokes about the foreman, stories from back home. For a few minutes, you weren't a nameless laborer. You were part of something, a team, a gang with a name. And yes, the gangs had names. So the sun finally sets. The brutal heat of the day gives way to the cold desert night. Your shift is over. Your back is screaming. Your hands are bleeding through the rope burns. Time to relax, right? Well, sort of. Because nights at the workers' village weren't exactly peaceful. They were loud, chaotic, and occasionally violent. When you cram 20,000 exhausted, stressed, underpaid men into a confined space with limited entertainment options, things get interesting. And by interesting, I mean messy. Let's start with the drinking. Remember that thick, nutritious beer you got with your daily rations? The stuff that was supposed to hydrate you and keep you healthy? Yeah, some workers saved it up. Instead of drinking their daily jug responsibly throughout the day, they'd hoard it, trade it, barter for extra rations. And then, once the sun went down and the foreman stopped watching, they'd gather in small groups and drink everything at once. Suddenly, the Drunkards of Menkaure gang name makes a lot more sense, doesn't it? Ancient Egyptians didn't have a concept of responsible drinking. They had a concept of drink until you forget you have to haul stones tomorrow. And on particularly rough weeks, when the heat had been unbearable and the work had been brutal, men would gather around small fires in the courtyards and drink themselves into oblivion. The beer wasn't strong by modern standards, maybe 3 to 4% alcohol. But drink enough of it, especially on an empty or exhausted stomach, and you'd be stumbling around the dormitory, singing off-key hymns to Ra and telling your bunkmate that you loved him, man, you really loved him. By morning, you'd wake up with a splitting headache, a mouth that tasted like fermented barley, and the vague memory of promising the foreman you'd work twice as hard today. Congratulations. Welcome to the ancient world's first construction site hangover. But drinking wasn't the only nighttime activity. There was gambling. Yes, ancient Egyptian pyramid workers gambled. Because apparently, when your life is already a gamble, will I survive another day hauling stones? You might as well bet on something you can control. The most popular game was Senet, an ancient Egyptian board game that's been around since before the pyramids. It was played on a grid with pieces that moved based on the throw of sticks or bones, basically ancient dice. Workers would gather around crude Senet boards, scratched into the dirt or drawn on flat stones. They'd bet bread rations, beer jugs, or even their next day off if they were feeling particularly reckless. And just like modern gambling, some men were very good at it, others not so much. There were also simpler games, knucklebones, throwing small bones and betting on how they'd land, dice carved from stone or bone, betting on which worker could lift the heaviest stone, who could drink the most beer, or who could tell the most outrageous story without laughing. Because when you're living in a barracks with 39 other sweaty men, entertainment becomes essential. And if that entertainment involved the possibility of winning an extra loaf of bread, even better. But gambling had consequences. Lose too much and you'd go hungry. Owe another worker too many rations, and suddenly you'd find yourself doing their share of the work. Debts weren't written down, there were no contracts, but everyone remembered. And in a community where reputation mattered, being known as someone who didn't pay their debts was a dangerous label. Some nights arguments would erupt. Maybe someone accused another of cheating at Senet. Maybe a worker refused to pay up after losing a bet. Maybe someone just looked at someone else the wrong way after too much beer, and then fists would fly. Remember those skull fractures archaeologists found? The ones with evidence of face-to-face assault from right-handed attackers? Yeah, not all of those happen on the job site. Fights broke out regularly, not full-scale brawls. The foreman would shut those down fast, but one-on-one scuffles in the dark corners of the village. A quick punch, a shove, maybe a headbutt if things got serious. Most fights ended quickly. Someone's friends would pull them apart. An older worker would step in and remind everyone that they had work in the morning. The two fighters would glare at each other, mutter insults, and walk away nursing bruises. But occasionally things escalated. If a fight got too violent, or if someone seriously injured another worker, the overseers would step in, and that's when punishment started. Ancient Egypt didn't have a formal justice system for workers. There were no trials, no juries, no lawyers arguing your case. Justice was swift, public, and painful. Minor offenses, stealing food, shirking work, disrespecting a foreman, might earn you a beating, wooden rods across the back or legs, painful, humiliating, and a very effective deterrent. More serious offenses, injuring another worker, sabotaging tools, or outright refusing to work, could result in harsher punishments. Flogging with leather whips, being forced to work extra shifts with reduced rations, or in extreme cases being sent away from the pyramid entirely, which meant losing your guaranteed food, your place in the crew, and your honor. For ancient Egyptians, being kicked off the pyramid project wasn't just losing a job, it was social death. You'd return to your village in shame, marked as someone who couldn't fulfill their duty to the pharaoh. Your family would know, your neighbors would know, and good luck finding respect after that. So most workers kept their heads down. They drank their beer, played their games, got into the occasional scuffle, But they didn't cross the line, because in the end, surviving the pyramid wasn't just about enduring the work. It was about navigating the social minefield of thousands of exhausted, stressed, competitive men living in close quarters. And if you managed that, if you made it through your shifts without getting injured, without losing all your rations in a bad Senate game, without getting flogged for punching your bunkmate, well, congratulations. You'd earned another day of hauling stones. But it wasn't all gambling and fighting. Some nights when the air was cool and the stars were bright, the workers' village would quiet down, the drunks would pass out, the gamblers would call it a night, and in the soft glow of dying fires, something beautiful would happen. Music, not grand orchestras or elaborate performances, just simple, raw human music. A man with a wooden flute carved from a reed, another with a small drum made from stretched animal hide, someone clapping a rhythm, someone else humming a tune passed down from their village. These weren't professional musicians. They were farmers, laborers, men with calloused hands who happened to know a few songs. But in those moments gathered around the fire, they weren't workers, they were human. The songs were usually slow, rhythmic, repetitive. Work songs that matched the pace of hauling stones, hymns to the gods, Ra, Osiris, Ptah, songs about the Nile, about home, about the harvest they'd return to. Some songs were funny, crude jokes set to music, mocking the foreman, the heat, the endless work. Laughter would ripple through the group, breaking the exhaustion for just a moment. And then there were the stories. Every village had a storyteller, someone who remembered the old tales, the myths, the legends, and at night, when the work was done and the body too tired to move, the mind craved escape, so the storytellers would begin. Tales of gods and monsters, Osiris being killed and resurrected, Horus battling Set for the throne of Egypt, Ra's journey through the underworld each night, fighting the serpent Apophis to ensure the sun would rise again. These weren't just entertainment, they were religion, culture, identity. They reminded the workers why they were here, why the pyramid mattered, why their suffering had meaning. Some storytellers were so good that workers from other barracks would quietly slip over to listen. Foremen would pretend not to notice. Even the overseers, hard men who spent their days shouting orders, would linger in the shadows, listening. Because everyone, from the lowest laborer to the highest administrator, needed to believe that they were part of something greater, that their pain served a purpose, that when they died, they'd be remembered, honored, maybe even welcomed into the afterlife for their service. The stories made that belief real. And on the best nights, when the storyteller was particularly skilled, when the music was just right, when the stars seemed closer than usual, the workers would forget, just for a moment, that they were tired, hungry, and broken. They'd forget the blisters, the heat, the endless blocks. They'd remember they were Egyptians, builders of eternity, part of a legacy that would outlast every empire, every war, every king. And then morning would come, the sun would rise, the foreman would shout, and it would all begin again. Here's something Hollywood never shows you. Pyramid workers had team spirit. You weren't just worker number 4, 3, and 27. You were part of an organized crew, a gang, with an actual name. And not boring names like Construction Team B. No, these were names with personality. Names that got scrawled on stone blocks as graffiti, left behind as proof that you were here, that you mattered. Names like the Friends of Khufu Gang, or the Drunkards of Menkaure, or, and this is real, the Vigorous Gang. Archaeologists found these inscriptions carved and painted on blocks deep inside the pyramids. places that were never meant to be seen again once construction was complete. Workers marked their blocks to show which crew cut the stone, transported it, or set it in place. It was partly for record keeping, partly for payment tracking, and partly just pride. You were part of the Friends of Khufu gang? Congratulations. You just pledged your loyalty to the pharaoh like you're joining an ancient fraternity. Except instead of hazing rituals, you haul rocks. Each gang was divided into smaller units called philes, a Greek word archaeologists use because we don't have a better term. Think of them as divisions. Each phyle had about 200 men in a specific job. One phyle cut stones at the quarry. Another transported them to the base of the pyramid. Another hauled them up the ramps. Another set them in place with precision that would make modern engineers weep. And within each phyle were even smaller groups, work teams of about 20 men, each with an overseer. The overseers had titles like Director of Craftsmen, Overseer of Stone Movers, Inspector of the Royal Tombs. These weren't random assignments. This was a sophisticated organizational chart. Someone kept track of who did what, how much they accomplished, and whether they deserved extra rations for a job well done. Because here's the kicker. The gangs competed. Yes, ancient Egyptian pyramid builders had workplace competition. Foremen would push their crews to move more blocks faster than the rival gang. There were quotas, records, and probably a lot of trash talk. Oh, the vigorous gang thinks they're so vigorous? Watch us move 3 blocks before lunch. This wasn't just about productivity. It was about camaraderie. When you're doing backbreaking labor in unbearable heat, the only thing that keeps you going is the guy next to you, your crew, your gang, your brothers in limestone. And when the work was done, when your block was set in place, perfectly aligned, you might have taken a moment to scratch your crew's name into the stone. A little piece of graffiti that said, "We were here, we did this." 4,500 years later, archaeologists would find those marks and realize these weren't slaves. These were workers with identities, pride, and just enough dark humor to name themselves the drunkards of Menkori. Now let's get to the actual work, the part where your body starts filing formal complaints. Your job, like most of the 10,000 workers on site, was moving stones, not small stones, not pebbles. Limestone blocks weighing between 2 and 15 tons each. For context, that's roughly the weight of 2 to 7 cars. And you didn't have forklifts. You had ropes, wooden sledges, and the deeply questionable assumption that if enough people pulled hard enough, physics would cooperate. Here's how it worked. First, the stone had to be cut from the quarry. If you were assigned to quarry duty, and let's assume you were, you spent your days crouched in the blazing sun, hammering copper chisels into limestone. Copper, not steel. Copper is soft. It bends. It dulls. You'd spend half your time sharpening your chisel on a grinding stone, the other half cursing the fact that metal tools were expensive and you had to make do with what you had. To cut a block, workers would hammer grooves into the natural stone face, insert wooden wedges, then soak the wedges with water. As the wood absorbed the water, it expanded, and with enough pressure, the stone would crack along the line. Controlled breaks, precision splitting. It was clever. It was effective. It was also incredibly slow. Once a block was free, it had to be shaped. Masons would chisel the rough edges, smooth the surfaces, and make sure the block was as close to perfect as possible. Because when you're stacking 2.3 million blocks into a pyramid that needs to stay standing for eternity, close enough doesn't cut it. Then came the transport. The block was loaded onto a wooden sledge, basically a giant sled. Ropes were tied around it. And then you, along with 19 other men, grabbed the ropes and started pulling. Except sand and sledges don't mix well. Friction is a nightmare. So someone had the brilliant idea to pour water on the sand in front of the sledge. The water made the sand firmer, more compact, reducing friction and making it easier to pull. Easier, not easy. You pulled, you strained, your shoulders burned, your back screamed, your hands blistered and bled through the rope fiber. The overseer shouted a rhythm, something to keep everyone pulling in sync, and you moved slowly, one agonizing step at a time. A large block could take 20 to 40 men to move. For perspective, that means the equivalent of half your village working together just to shift one block a few hundred meters, and once it reached the base of the pyramid, that's when things got really fun. So you've hauled your block across the plateau, your hands are bleeding, your back feels like it's been hit with a hammer, and you're standing at the base of a structure that's already 50 meters tall and still growing. Now you have to get the block up there. The Egyptians didn't have cranes. They didn't have pulleys in the way we think of them. What they had were ramps, big, long, ever-rising ramps made of mud brick, limestone rubble, and pure stubbornness. Archaeologists still debate exactly how the ramps were designed. Straight ramps, spiral ramps, internal ramps, a combination of all three. No one knows for sure because the ramps were dismantled after construction. But here's what we do know. You dragged blocks up those ramps. Imagine the sledge at a 10-degree incline. Now imagine pulling it. Now imagine the July sun turning the ramp into a convection oven. Now imagine doing this 300,000 times, because that's roughly how many blocks were in Khufu's pyramid. As the pyramid grew taller, the ramps had to grow longer to maintain a manageable angle. By the time you were placing blocks near the top, you were hauling them up ramps that stretched hundreds of meters. Some estimates suggest it took 20 to 30 men to haul a single block up the ramp. Overseers coordinated the effort, shouting rhythms, keeping everyone synchronized. One mistimed pull, and the whole operation could collapse, literally. And here's a detail that'll haunt you. Workers sometimes died on the ramps. A rope could snap, a sledge could tip, a man could lose his footing and fall. When you're 100 meters up on a narrow, mud brick ramp with no safety rails, one wrong step means a very long drop. Skeletons found in the workers' cemetery showed evidence of crushed vertebrae, shattered limbs, compression injuries. Some men walked away with lifelong disabilities. Others didn't walk away at all. But the work continued, because the pyramid wasn't going to build itself, and Pharaoh Khufu needed his stairway to the heavens finished before he died. So you pulled, you climbed, you prayed to the gods that the ropes held, that your footing stayed solid, that you'd live to see another ration of bread and beer. Let's talk about the weather, because if the work didn't kill you, the sun absolutely tried. Egypt in summer is not a pleasant place. Temperatures regularly hit 40 degrees, 104 degrees. On bad days, they'd soar past 49 degrees, 120 degrees. And you, dear pyramid builder, were working outside with no shade, no sunscreen, and definitely no air-conditioned break room. Your uniform was a simple linen loincloth, maybe a small linen cap if you were lucky. That was it. No shirt, no shoes. Just you, the sun, and several thousand tons of limestone radiating heat like a cosmic oven. Within an hour of work, you were drenched in sweat, your skin burned, your lips cracked, your head pounded from dehydration. The foreman understood this. Work shifts were broken into shorter bursts, maybe 3 to 4 hours at a time, with breaks in between. But even during breaks, there was no escape. The desert offered no shade. The best you could do was huddle against the north side of a partially built wall and pray for a breeze. Water was rationed carefully. You'd get beer in the morning, but water was precious. Delivered from the Nile, stored in clay jars, distributed sparingly. Drink too much and you'd be mocked. Drink too little and you'd collapse. Heat stroke was common. Men would suddenly stagger, fall to their knees, vomit, and lose consciousness. If they were lucky, someone dragged them into the shade and poured water on them. If they weren't lucky, they died right there on the ramp, and another worker took their place. And then there were the sandstorms. Every so often, the desert would decide it had enough of your pyramid-building ambitions. Winds would pick up, and suddenly the air was filled with stinging sand. Visibility dropped to nothing. You'd crouch down, wrap your face in your loincloth, and wait it out. The sand got everywhere, in your eyes, in your mouth, in your lungs. Days later, you'd still be coughing up grit. But the worst part? The psychological weight of the heat. Hour after hour, day after day, month after month, under that relentless sun. It broke men. Some just gave up, sat down, and refused to work. The overseers would try to motivate them. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. And when the day finally ended, when the sun dipped below the horizon and the temperature dropped, you'd limp back to your dormitory, collapse on your stone sleeping platform, and dream of the day you'd return to your village, where, ironically, you'd probably complain that it was too hot to work the fields. Let's talk about what happened when you really messed up. Because working on the pyramid wasn't just dangerous, it was strictly regulated. There were rules, hierarchies, expectations, and if you broke them, there were consequences. Ancient Egypt didn't mess around with workplace discipline. Let's say you decided to sleep in one morning. Maybe you were exhausted. Maybe you'd had too much beer the night before. Maybe your back hurt so badly you just couldn't move. Didn't matter. When the overseer came through the barracks at dawn, banging on walls and shouting for everyone to get up, you were expected to be on your feet instantly. If you weren't, first offense, a verbal warning, loud, public, humiliating. The overseer would stand over you and berate you in front of your entire crew. Your gang would hear it. Your reputation would take a hit. Second offense, physical punishment. You'd be dragged outside, forced to kneel, and beaten with a wooden rod across your back. Not enough to permanently injure you. They needed you working, but enough to hurt, enough to make you think twice about doing it again. Third offense, say, you'd be reassigned to the worst jobs, the ones nobody wanted, hauling waste, cleaning latrines, moving rubble. Your rations might be reduced. Your crew might distance themselves from you because you were now a liability. Keep it up, and you'd be sent home, disgraced, dishonored, a failure. But sleeping in was a minor offense, so let's talk about the serious stuff. Theft was a major problem in a community of 20,000 people living in close quarters. Food would go missing, tools would disappear, someone's good luck amulet would vanish overnight. If you were caught stealing, the punishment was brutal. For stealing food, bread, beer, a piece of dried fish, you'd be publicly flogged, leather whips across your bare back while your crew watched. The goal wasn't just punishment, it was deterrence. Make an example so others wouldn't try. For stealing tools, copper chisels, ropes, anything essential to the work, the punishment was worse. More lashes, possibly having your rations cut in half for a week, and your gang would hate you because your theft made everyone look bad. For stealing from the pharaoh materials meant for the pyramid, gold leaf, sacred objects, you'd be lucky if they just beat you. More likely, you'd be branded, literally, a mark burned into your skin, so everyone would know you were a thief. You'd carry that shame for the rest of your life. And if your theft was particularly egregious, execution, not common, but it happened. Public executions served as powerful reminders that the pyramid project was sacred. Stealing from it was stealing from the gods, and the gods didn't forgive. Then there were fights. We already talked about the occasional nighttime scuffle, but if a fight resulted in serious injury, a broken bone, a damaged eye, anything that prevented a worker from doing their job, the consequences were severe. Both fighters would be punished regardless of who started it. The logic was simple. Fighting meant two workers were now useless instead of one. You weren't just hurting each other, you were hurting the project. Punishments for serious fights included public flogging, both participants, extra work shifts with no additional pay, being forced to work together on the same task until you sorted out your differences, in extreme cases, expulsion from the project. And here's where it gets interesting. Some foremen used creative punishments. If two workers couldn't stop fighting, they'd be chained together, literally, forced to work side by side, eat together, sleep in the same space. The idea was that they'd either learn to tolerate each other or drive each other so crazy that they'd beg to be separated and promise to behave. It was ancient Egypt's version of, you're both grounded until you learn to get along. There were also punishments for laziness. Foremen kept track of productivity, how many blocks your crew moved, how quickly you completed tasks. If your gang consistently underperformed, everyone suffered. Reduced rations, longer shifts, public shaming, and if one worker was dragging the whole team down, the gang would handle it themselves. Not violently most of the time, but through social pressure, ostracism, refusing to share food, making it clear that the lazy worker was no longer welcome. Peer pressure was a powerful motivator when survival depended on teamwork. Some workers cracked under the pressure. The heat, the pain, the endless labor, the punishments, it was too much. Some men would break down, refuse to work, sit in the sand and stare at nothing. The first time, overseers might be sympathetic. They'd seen it before. They'd give the man a day of rest, some extra water, maybe reassign him to lighter duties. But if it happened again, that worker would be sent home because the pyramid couldn't afford weak links. The project was too important, the timeline too tight. If you couldn't handle it, someone else would take your place. And here's the darkest part. Some workers didn't want to go home. Despite everything, the heat, the injuries, the punishments, the exhaustion, some men had come to see the pyramid as their purpose, their identity, going back to their village, back to farming, back to obscurity, felt worse than dying on the job site. So they'd push through, broken bodies, shattered spirits, but still working. Because at least here on the pyramid, they mattered. They were part of something eternal. And even if it killed them, at least they'd die as builders of the gods. Here's the thing about moving multi-ton blocks with Bronze Age technology. People got hurt. A lot. Skeletal remains from the workers' cemetery paint a grim picture. Broken bones. Crushed vertebrae. Compressed spines. Shattered limbs. Dislocated joints. These weren't occasional accidents, they were occupational hazards. Let's start with the most common injury. Back problems. When you spend months hauling rope, pulling sledges, and lifting stones, your spine takes a beating. Archaeologists found evidence of degenerative arthritis in the lower vertebrae of almost every worker skeleton. Some men's spines had compressed so much they'd lost inches of height. Imagine being 25 years old and walking like you're 60. That was normal for pyramid builders. Then there were the fractures. Arms, legs, ribs, collarbones, sometimes from falls, sometimes from stones slipping, sometimes from sheer bad luck. But here's what's remarkable. Many of these fractures had healed. And not just healed well. Bones had been set properly, aligned, splinted. Some men walked away with only minor limps. Others went back to work after recovery. This means ancient Egypt had doctors, real doctors. People who understood how to set bones, treat infections, and manage pain. Workers who suffered injuries weren't left to die. They were cared for. Archaeologists even found evidence of successful amputations. 2 skeletons showed clean cuts where limbs had been removed, 1 leg, 1 arm, and the bones had healed over, meaning the men survived the surgery and lived for years afterward. Think about that. Bronze Age surgeons were performing amputations without anesthesia, without antibiotics, without modern surgical tools. And some patients survived. They used copper blades, cauterized wounds with fire, applied honey as an antiseptic, and wrapped injuries in linen soaked in medicinal herbs. It wasn't pretty, but it worked often enough to matter. Other injuries were grimmer. Depressed skull fractures suggested men had been hit in the head, possibly by falling stones, possibly by tools, possibly by other workers in disputes. Some of these fractures showed signs of healing, meaning the victims survived. Others didn't. One particularly haunting detail: many skull fractures were on the left side, suggesting face-to-face assaults from right-handed attackers. Whether these were accidents, fights, or something worse, we'll never know. There was also evidence of hernias, bulging tissue from the strain of lifting, torn muscles, dislocated shoulders, chronic pain that followed men for the rest of their lives. And yet, despite all this, people kept working. Why? Because for many, this was still a better deal than starving in their villages. Guaranteed food, medical care, a sense of purpose. Not everyone survived. Some men died from their injuries, others from infections, some from sheer exhaustion. But those who did survive carried the scars of the pyramid with them forever, visible reminders that they had been part of something monumental, even if it cost them dearly. Let's talk about what happened when you actually got hurt, because, surprisingly, ancient Egypt had something resembling a healthcare system. When you broke a bone, and you would because hauling 2-ton blocks isn't exactly OSHA compliant, you weren't just left to hobble around. You were taken to a medical facility within the workers' village. These weren't hospitals in the modern sense. They were more like large tents or mud brick rooms staffed by people we'd call doctors today, though the Egyptians called them SW&W, healers. The healers knew anatomy surprisingly well. They understood that the heart pumped blood, that the brain controlled the body, and that infection could kill. They had treatments for everything from broken bones to infected wounds to digestive problems. Broken bones were set with wooden splints, wrapped tightly in linen bandages, and sometimes reinforced with tree resin to harden the cast. The alignment was often remarkably good, evidence of skilled practitioners who knew what they were doing. For open wounds, they used honey. Yes, honey. It turns out honey is a natural antibacterial agent, and ancient Egyptians figured this out thousands of years before germ theory. They'd clean the wound, pack it with honey, and wrap it in linen. It worked. Infection rates were lower than you'd expect. They also used other natural remedies. Willow bark tea for pain. It contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin. Garlic for infections, natural antibiotic properties. Aloe vera for burns, because the sun was brutal. Frankincense and myrrh for inflammation. Some treatments were less scientific. Got a headache? Try a poultice made from crushed mouse droppings mixed with honey. Stomach problems? Eat some crushed beetles. Cursed by an angry spirit? Well, that's what the priests were for. But despite the occasional nonsense, many treatments genuinely helped. And the fact that workers received medical care at all is significant. This wasn't a system that viewed workers as disposable. They were investments, trained laborers who'd learned their jobs. Losing one meant training a replacement. There's even evidence of dental care. Abscessed teeth were drained. Broken teeth were pulled. It was agonizing, no anesthesia except maybe some strong beer, but it beat dying from an infected tooth. And then there were the truly remarkable cases. Archaeologists found evidence of brain surgery, trepanation, drilling holes into the skull to relieve pressure or remove tumors. Some patients survived. You can tell because the bone shows signs of healing around the edges of the hole. Imagine that. A Bronze Age surgeon with copper tools drilling into your skull while you're either unconscious from head trauma or biting down on leather strap, and you actually survive. Another skeleton showed evidence of what might be the world's earliest documented case of syphilis, a sexually transmitted disease. The man had been treated, though we don't know how successfully. Others showed signs of birth complications that had been managed by midwives. Women in the workers' village gave birth, sometimes with complications, and there were people trained to help. The presence of medical care fundamentally changes how we think about pyramid construction. This wasn't a death march. It was a state-sponsored project with workers' welfare, however minimal, taken into account. You'd still be in constant pain. You'd still have scars. You'd still lose friends to accidents and disease. But if you broke your arm, someone would set it. If you got an infected cut, someone would treat it. If you survived, you'd go back to work because the pyramid wasn't finished yet. Now let's talk about why you were doing all this in the first place. Because moving stones until your spine compressed wasn't just about obeying the pharaoh. It was about something bigger, something cosmic. You weren't just building a tomb, you were building a gateway to eternity. In ancient Egyptian belief, the pharaoh wasn't just a king. He was a living god, the earthly embodiment of Horus, and the son of Ra, the sun god. When he died, he would journey through the underworld, be judged by Osiris, and if found worthy, join the gods in the afterlife. The pyramid was his vehicle for that journey. It was a stairway to the stars, a physical representation of the primordial mound that emerged from the waters of chaos at the beginning of time. Every block you moved was a step toward the divine. And here's the thing, you believed it. You weren't a modern skeptic rolling your eyes at religious propaganda. You were an ancient Egyptian who'd been raised in a culture where the gods were real, the afterlife was certain, and the pharaoh's divinity was as obvious as the sun rising each morning. Working on the pyramid wasn't just labor, it was a religious duty, a way to earn favor with the gods, a guarantee that when you died, you'd be remembered, honored, buried near the sacred monument. Priests were everywhere on the construction site. They performed daily rituals, made offerings to the gods, blessed the stones before they were placed. They chanted hymns to Ra as the sun rose, asking for protection and strength for the workers. There were also rituals tied to specific construction milestones, when the cornerstone was laid, when a new level was completed, when the capstone was finally placed. Each event was marked with ceremony, incense, prayers, and probably a lot of beer. The priests also served as mediators between the workers and the divine. If a man was injured, a priest might perform a healing ritual alongside the doctor's treatment. If someone died, a priest would oversee the burial rites, ensuring the soul could reach the afterlife. And here's something interesting. Many workers' tombs contained small statues of themselves, depicted as if they were still working on the pyramid in the afterlife. Because in Egyptian belief, you'd continue your profession in the next world. If you were a stonemason in life, you'd be a stonemason in death, which means eternity looked a lot like more hauling blocks, but at least you'd be in the company of the gods while doing it. The meaning mattered. It gave men the strength to keep going, when their bodies were screaming to stop. It turned brutal labor into sacred service. You weren't a slave. You were a builder of eternity. And when the pyramid was finally finished, when the white limestone casing stones gleamed in the sun like a beacon to the heavens, you'd know that you'd helped create one of the greatest structures in human history, even if your back would never be the same again. After 3 or 4 months of this, hauling, pulling, climbing, sweating, bleeding, your shift finally ended. The flood season was over. The Nile had receded. Your fields were once again exposed, fertile, and ready for planting. The scribes checked their lists, confirmed you'd fulfilled your labor obligation, and released you. You were free to go home. But you weren't the same person who left. Your hands were calloused beyond recognition. Your shoulders were broader, your arms stronger, but your back was a disaster. You walked with a slight limp from an injury that never quite healed. Your teeth hurt from chewing gritty bread. Your skin was darker, more weathered, aged beyond your years. You packed your small bag, the same one you'd arrived with, now more worn, and joined the stream of workers heading back south. Some men laughed, relieved to be going home. Others were quiet, exhausted, reflecting on friends who wouldn't be making the journey back. As you walked away from Giza, you turned one last time to look at the pyramid. It was bigger now than when you'd arrived, taller, more complete. Somewhere in that massive structure was a block you'd moved, a stone you'd pulled, a tiny piece of eternity that bore your sweat, your blood, your strength. You'd never forget it. And in a way, it would never forget you. Because carved somewhere on one of those stones, hidden deep inside where no one would ever see, was a bit of graffiti from your gang. The Friends of Khufu were here. So, let's be honest, you wouldn't have lasted, not because you're weak, not because you lack determination, but because you're used to a world with worker protections, ergonomic equipment, and the basic assumption that jobs shouldn't slowly destroy your body. Medieval peasants had it rough. Victorian factory workers had it rough. But pyramid builders, they were operating on a whole different level of this job will break you. You'd show up with your 21st century spine, your soft office worker hands, your expectation of bathroom breaks and OSHA regulations, and within an hour, you'd be on the ground, gasping, wondering why the ancient Egyptians didn't invent the forklift. The heat alone would wreck you. Modern construction sites shut down when temperatures hit certain thresholds. Ancient Egypt didn't have that luxury. You worked in 120-degree AF heat, or you didn't eat. The labor would destroy you. You're not used to pulling multi-ton stones up ramps. Your body hasn't been conditioned by a lifetime of agricultural work. Your muscles would give out. Your joints would scream. Your back would file a formal complaint. The food, while surprisingly decent, would still take some getting used to. Gritty bread that wears down your teeth. Thick beer that's more food than drink. Meat roasted over an open fire with questionable seasoning. Your modern stomach would rebel. The sleeping conditions would wreck you. Stone platforms, no privacy. 39 other men, snoring, coughing, and occasionally sleep-talking about home. You'd get maybe 4 hours of restless sleep before the sun rose and the work began again. And the injuries? Modern workers get workman's comp, physical therapy, pain medication. You'd get honey, a splint, and if you were lucky, a few days of rest before being sent back to haul more stones. But here's the thing, ancient Egyptian pyramid builders didn't just survive this. They thrived in a strange, broken body kind of way. They formed teams, developed pride in their work, and built something so monumental that it's still standing 4,500 years later. You wouldn't last a day. But them, they lasted decades, and honestly, that's worth remembering. 20 years after construction began, the Great Pyramid of Khufu was complete. The final block, the capstone, was placed at the very top of the pyramid in a grand ceremony. It was covered in gold or electrum, a gold-silver alloy, designed to catch the first and last rays of the sun, making the pyramid shine like a beacon across the desert. Thousands of workers gathered at the base to watch. Priests chanted, incense burned. The pharaoh himself may have been present, though he was old now, nearing the end of his reign. As the capstone was hauled up the final ramp and carefully set into place, a cheer rose from the crowd, not because the work was over, though that was certainly part of it, but because they'd done it. They'd built a mountain. The pyramid stood 146 meters tall, 481 feet, the tallest man-made structure in the world. It would hold that title for the next 3,800 years. It was perfectly aligned to the cardinal directions, with an accuracy that modern engineers still marvel at. It contained 2.3 million blocks, each one placed with precision, and every single block had been moved by human hands. No aliens, no lost technology, just people. Tens of thousands of people working together, generation after generation, hauling stones under the brutal sun because they believed in something greater than themselves. In the years that followed, workers left. Some returned to their villages and lived out their lives farming the fields, telling stories about the time they helped build the pyramid. Others stayed at Giza working on Khufu's successors' pyramids, Khafra and Menkaure. Some were buried near the pyramid, their graves simple but honored, their bodies laid to rest in the shadow of eternity. And the pyramid? It stood. Through dynasties, through empires rising and falling, through invasions, earthquakes, sandstorms, and the slow erosion of millennia. When Alexander the Great visited Egypt in 332 BCE, the pyramid was already 2,200 years old, more ancient to him than he is to us. When Julius Caesar walked through Giza, it had stood for 20,500 years. When the first tourists came in the Middle Ages, it had stood for 4,000 years. And today, 4,600 years after construction began, it's still there. Worn, stripped of its white limestone casing, shorter than it once was, but still standing. Still a testament to human ambition, ingenuity, and the willingness to endure suffering in pursuit of something eternal. The men who built it are long gone. Their names, mostly forgotten. Their bodies, dust. But the pyramid remains. And in a way, that's exactly what they wanted. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep in your comfortable bed with your climate control and your ergonomic pillows, take a moment to appreciate that you're not hauling limestone blocks up a ramp in the Egyptian sun. The pyramid builders of ancient Egypt weren't slaves. They weren't aliens. They were people. Ordinary, extraordinary people who did something we can still barely comprehend. They moved mountains, one block at a time, and they did it without safety harnesses, without modern tools, and without complaining too much, at least not in any records that survived. So the next time someone tells you they just don't build things like they used to, remember, yeah, because the labor laws won't let us anymore. Sleep well.